As 21st century political and military commentators have emphasized, the battle spaces defining modern warfare are not just muddy fields and contested waters. Modern conflicts extend into civil and digital spaces, and frequently involve private citizens. Further, the lines between adversary nation-states have blurred as private entities operate highly advanced technologies not just in conflict, but for selling products and establishing narratives. Psychotronics is undeniably the holy grail of unconventional warfare and social engineering. In a world where economic and social interactions take place in a domain arbitrated by both state and commercial interests, we are becoming more and more aware that our day-to-day decisions as private citizens have real effects on the spaces where experimental technologies are deployed as intelligence-gathering tools and as weapons. What kinds of weaponized technologies are well understood by the public? You have chemical and nuclear processes, hypersonic and stealth engineering, cavitation, magnetohydrodynamics. Each of these potentially disruptive technologies are discussed openly in society, though their technical specifications are managed in part or whole by private entities and remain largely outside of academia. So why is the field of psychotronics so rarely the topic of conversation? Is it perhaps the technology's colorful history, which began in parapsychology as a means of enhancing telekinesis, or its somewhat disturbing track record of use against American and Soviet citizens in the Cold War? This video will be a first-time look at the functional aspects of psychotronics for some, since the topic tends to be, for lack of a better word, unpopular. I've provided sources and additional information in the comments for those interested. We'll break our thought process down into 3 core points to guide our discussion. The developmental trajectory of this tech, determined by its developers' motivations and directives, hasn't fundamentally changed. Complexity correlates with generations as systems are developed, applied, and then observed in action and lessons are learned. Recent developments may be classified, but theory of operation is relatively simple science. We know what exact systems have been developed and can reveal their capabilities. To set the stage, we'll look at some psychotronic systems patents, starting with one that might be familiar to some. This 1965 patent is relatively well known due to the interest surrounding its applicant, Henry K. Puharich, also known as Andrija Puharich, who essentially wrote the book on early American parapsychology, focusing on telepathy and telekinesis. He introduced popular figures such as Uri Geller and Peter Hurkos into official parapsychology research in the United States. It's worth noting Puharich published some of the first research on the topic of nerve conduction. Though today we consider electrical stimulation of nerves and muscles an obvious tool in medicine, Puharich is at the forefront of what would eventually become a weapons technology, as well as being the father of Western parapsychology, making him a contentious figure in both communities. The patent has stipulations for various systems that send pulsed electrical signals into nerves in the face and mandible, with the understanding that the nervous system of the auditory centers are connected to the nerves of the teeth and face. Charged rods or battery-powered dental implants acting as radio wave receivers can be used to stimulate an auditory experience. Electrodes positioned near the head or spine allow the device to transmit audio information via the nervous system using modulated electromagnetic waves between 20 and 200 kHz. A radio frequency signal modulated with audio, such as speech or music, is applied through the insulated electrodes. This creates a localized electric field that induces the sensation of hearing audio without conventional sound, and is tailored to the individual's nervous system response. Both patents describe methods for simulating auditory experiences using electrical signals. One interesting feature of this approach is that the signal can be converted directly from acoustic to electrical without the need for software. We already know from bone conduction tech that acoustic waves acting on the skeleton can simulate hearing. Now we also know that electricity can replicate this phenomenon by acting on the nervous system directly. Recall also that the microwave hearing effect allows microwaves to also simulate speech by vibrating body tissues. An audio signal processing circuit detects ambient sounds via microphones and generates a control signal to adjust the subliminal signal's volume, increasing it with louder ambient noise and decreasing it with quieter conditions. A masking signal, which prevents conscious perception of the subliminal message, is combined with the subliminal signal, and both are adjusted in amplitude to maintain the subliminal message below conscious recognition. The system slowly increases the subliminal signal's amplitude to reduce distortion, and rapidly decreases it to avoid conscious detection during sudden ambient noise drops. This setup may employ anti-shoplifting messages like "I am honest, I will not steal," to enhance subconscious perception while keeping the message imperceptible, with experimental results showing reduced shoplifting losses in this case. This patent outlines how software can be used to modulate music with multiple tones, which can be selected to induce different types of brain entrainment. In this context, brain entrainment is akin to hypnosis, but can also affect changes in a person while they are unconscious. To be clear, it can be argued that all music causes a degree of brain entrainment. Indeed, many activities, such as watching movies, meditation, or physical activities, will induce different brain states. The unique function of this patent is its ability to induce these states without making the target aware, and specifically choosing the desired brain states. The patent discusses how repetition of an edited sound file will lead to a stronger subconscious response over time. All of the potential effects, described as therapeutic in the patent, can also clearly be applied in more nefarious ways. Any already noisy environment could be targeted with acoustic waves tuned to interfere with environmental noise and produce the desired effects. This is the first patent we'll look at with an explicit military function, filed by Raytheon Corporation. A radar transmitter and receiver are used to both identify and track a target, with the capability to track moving targets in different conditions. The patent includes a succinct description of what makes this system different from typical electronic warfare systems used commonly by major militaries. A primary difference between an RFDE weapon and an electronic warfare system is power and kill mode. An electronic warfare system makes use of a priori knowledge of a target it is designed to jam or disrupt. An electronic warfare system uses such a priori knowledge of a target's characteristics, e.g. frequency of operation, method of operation, etc., to disrupt or confuse the target with finesse, or a relatively low amount of power. On the other hand, an RFDE weapon can go after a broad range of targets, electronic, biological, ordnance structures, etc., due to its relatively large radiated power. A priori knowledge of the intended target characteristics is typically not required because the RFDE weapon either burns out or overwhelms its target by the sheer amount of power it radiates. The patent also explains that the technology is not solely limited to military application and can be used to disrupt weather conditions or destroy contaminants at a distance, to cite the patent. So far, we've looked at proposals using specific types of energy: direct electrical stimulation, radar, acoustic, and microwaves, and how they can be used to create resonances in soft tissues and bone. If you're paying attention, you might be begging the question: I know electrical impulses can influence the electrical activity in the central nervous system, because electrical current propagates in soft tissues, including the CNS. But how does an electromagnetic field trigger electrical activity in the CNS without high current electron potential? This is a question that apparently hasn't been properly answered after more than a half a century of research directed towards it. It's a simple question. How does a magnetic field influence human biology? And more specifically, can it affect specific processes within a cell? Let's take an aside to discuss magnetism. From the moment magnetism was identified as a physical phenomenon, it has been associated with rejuvenation and healing. The legend of the Greek shepherd Magnus, as told by Pliny's Natural History from 80 BC, tells of a shepherd who discovers the nails in his shoes and the iron tip of his cane were attracted to ores in the ground. The legend also says Magnus carried these magnetic ores with him and noticed he could walk longer and farther than before when he did. This story repeats throughout the ancient world, with the Magnus character changing heritage to reflect different cultures. If you research this question in the modern scientific literature, you'll find studies with varying conclusions, but there is no doubt EM therapy has a degree of effectiveness. The FDA has approved pulsed electromagnetic field therapy, or PEMF, allowing clinical use for healing sprains and fractures. It's important to realize that within the body of magnetic medical research, there are two distinct categories: those using aforementioned pulsed fields and those using fixed solid magnets. The former is tentatively accepted while the latter is not. Officially, there is no complete theory to describe how EM influences the human nervous system nor its other tissues. What would an agency with classified access, like, for example, NASA, say about this idea? Document MSc TOPS 112, Apparatus for Enhancing Tissue Repair in Mammals, appears on NASA's Technology Transfer Program directory, part of research funded by the Manned Spacecraft Center. Licensing for this tech is available, and references two NASA patents. Both patents describe a simple wearable electromagnetic device that is placed over a damaged limb to accelerate tissue and bone repair. Within these two patents, we find several interesting points. It's noted that many EM healing devices use an excessively strong field, and that the NASA system can operate off a 9-volt battery in contrast. It also mentions that solid magnets have been used widely by veterinarians to heal broken bones in animals, regardless of the lack of clear clinical data in humans. Quote, "The theory of magnetic healing can be seen by looking at early records of civilization, which tell us that magnetic forces have long been prized for their restorative properties. When ancient Greeks discovered natural magnets, they dubbed them lodestones, and Hippocrates, the father of medicine, noted their healing powers. The Egyptians, too, described the divine powers of magnetic rock in their writings, and Cleopatra famously adorned herself with magnetic jewelry in the hope of preserving youthfulness. Chinese manuscripts dating back thousands of years describe the Eastern belief that the life force, termed qi, is generated by the Earth's magnetic field. Today, many believe that certain locations on Earth owe their healing properties to naturally high levels of this biomagnetic energy. The patent makes some initially provocative claims. No one, prior to this invention, has found the key to electromagnetic regeneration of mammalian tissue. To be successful in tissue regeneration, the electromagnetic force may be a square wave, a Fourier curve, time-varying electromagnetic wave, at a level of approximately 0.05 to 0.5 Gauss, a much lower level than previously contemplated by anyone. We should realize these patents date to the 1990s to mid-2000s, and numerous commercial devices now exist on the market that demonstrate the principles of time-varying electromagnetic fields, or TVEMF. The criteria for the device in the patent is simple: a circular coil of about 10 windings per inch, and electricity being delivered in a square wave, with time varying between 0.05 and 0.5 Gauss. 0.05 to 0.5 Gauss is an interesting value because it describes a commonly encountered range of EM. The Earth's magnetic field, for example, fluctuates around 0.25 and 0.65 Gauss, and geomagnetic anomalies can produce even more. Household appliances tend to produce up to 1 Gauss in close proximity. This tells us that modulation of EM is more important in the context of biophysics than sheer power of the field. If a gently oscillating magnetic field is the key, as the NASA patents claim, then the healing effects of EM are more accessible than we thought. Although not in the scope of the patent, it's possible geophysical sources could be used to aid in healing, giving credence to some ancient healing practices. Intense magnetic fields are known in medicine to be harmful. The World Health Organization, for example, limits chronic exposure to 10 Gauss. Continual exposure is said to interfere with heart rhythm, but neural effects are not well understood. The heart and brain produce far weaker magnetic fields, about 10 to the negative 9th or 10 to the negative 7th Gauss. Now that we can say for certain that living cells are influenced by EM, we should discern exactly what cellular processes are affected. Another technology from the NASA Manned Spacecraft Center Project Archives provides exactly what we're looking for. MSc TOPS 100 describes what magnetic fields can control within a cell. Quote, "Alternating ionic magnetic resonance culture system stimulates the expression and regulation of various genes, including transcription factors, and to alter the activity of the genome to result in modified output of existing cellular proteins, such as cell transport proteins involved in regulating ionic concentration, membrane transport, and other crucial pathways in the regulation of growth, development, and differentiation, dedifferentiation, cell maintenance, inflammation, and aging-related mechanisms in animals and plants." Control over these processes does make sense. Crucial cellular processes utilize ion and electric gradients that can be influenced with magnetic fields. The patent leverages these effects in a new type of bioreactor. You may be familiar with bioreactors. These are machines used to grow cell cultures in a way that resembles the conditions found in a complex organism. There is great interest in these systems today for growing artificial organs and observing stem cell specialization. The patent points out that bioreactors, with their many moving parts and hermetic seals, have clear downsides. It also notes the TVEMF approach is already popular in some bioreactor systems by the time of the patent's writing. In contrast to TVEMF, this patent uses an approach known as alternating ionic magnetic resonance, or AIMR. This is a pretty simple idea. You use an oscillating magnetic field to induce flow in an ionic fluid. This occurs thanks to a phenomenon known as ion cyclotron resonance, or ICR, where ionized molecules move in a circular motion within a magnetic field. You can see why agitating a fluid in this way is an effective replacement for a traditional bioreactor that spins to induce fluid motion. The frequency of electromagnetic energy used for this process is not arbitrary. The patent notes best results when fields interfere to create the Schumann resonances. Quote, "The generated alternating ionic magnetic resonance field produces a series of controlled resonating waveforms that mimic the Schumann resonances, which are global electromagnetic frequencies that are excited by lightning discharges, with more precision than are created naturally." End quote. If we're able to surround a cell culture with low-intensity TVEMF and provoke changes at the cellular level, we should also be able to leverage relatively low-tech systems like a home's electrical wiring to influence human awareness. Patent US 8579793B1 describes how this is done. By modulating the power frequency in a home or building's electrical wiring, electromagnetic fields are produced that entrain brainwaves. Quote, "Rather than simply creating a trance-like state in the humans and animals within the premises, the present invention establishes a 24-hour circadian rhythm supportive of a mammal's internal circadian and subsequent ultraradian rhythms for improved sleep and improved awake periods. A light-sensitive photosensor is used to determine ambient light levels within the premises, which information is then transmitted to a microcontroller. The microcontroller, clocked by a quartz crystal, with a fundamental resonance frequency very close to a Fibonacci number, then generates frequencies selected to induce brainwave entrainment, either in support of natural sleep cycles or during periods of relative darkness, or in support of learning, expanded awareness, and relaxation during periods of relative lightness. These frequencies, one significantly higher than the other, are then XOR modulated using an H-bridge. The output of the H-bridge is then capacitively coupled to a premise's AC power line. That's pretty technical. In other words, the effect can be applied externally by adding a small device to the power grid serving a building. You don't need to enter the building and alter its wiring. You can do all of this externally by interacting with the power grid. The patent explores therapeutic uses, stating that as long as the applied frequency is within 1% of a Fibonacci number between 75,000 and 102 million Hz, it can produce a range of entrainment states that correspond to a normal circadian and ultradian rhythm. Humans within the field will be more attuned to the cycle of sleep and wakefulness. Larger cycles can be stimulated too, mirroring the subtle changes humans experience in their own biological seasons, as their body changes and as the seasons progress. Let's take a moment and talk about signal scattering, also called attenuation. As an EM field penetrates an object, it scatters in an unpredictable way as it refracts through different types of material. This is a major consideration for all neural interfaces and psychotronics. At this point, I'd like to introduce the phenomenon of time reversal.
Here we have a tank of water. We're going to disturb the water by dropping in these logos, and the waves from that disturbance propagate out towards the boundary of the tank. Now imagine that the walls of the tank have the ability to record the waves and can then vibrate to recreate those waves in reverse order. In doing so, it creates the time-reversed wave, which will propagate as if we're watching a video of the original disturbance in reverse, until ultimately it recreates the indent of those logos at the instant that it hit the water. Such wave tanks do in fact exist.
Time reversal is a fascinating subject that I'll discuss in detail in another video. For now, we'll look at it in simpler terms, and I suggest you look into the links provided in the comments section for more information. Consider a signal source like an acoustic microphone inside a house. Now imagine you have arranged listening devices around the perimeter of the house. The audio signal is detected at varying frequencies by each listening devices on the perimeter, and these feeds are plugged into a computer. After the signal is analyzed, we can reverse its scattering as it moves through the house, through windows, and eventually outside, giving us an accurate 3D model of the house's interior. Using sound limits imaging to any places that a sound wave can enter. Electromagnetic frequencies penetrate or reflect off different materials. Wood and concrete absorb EM, and water tends to reflect it. Now, repeat the experiment, but remove the source of sound and place it outside, focused on one of the open windows. The sound travels into the house and bounces around before coming back out to the detectors. It will take longer to compile the data, but over time we will have an accurate image of the house's interior. Now imagine instead of a low-power signal for detection, you use a high-power signal that is produced from multiple sources and interferes constructively inside the object. This will generate a focal point in 3 dimensions where waves converge. This exact method has been used to destroy tumors in the human body using acoustic waves, which bypass organs and bone to focus on otherwise unreachable places. You can do this with not just acoustic waves, but radar, microwaves, Wi-Fi, and light, though higher frequencies are computationally more difficult. Strategies employed in known time reversal systems have more or less solved this issue. You would think that having more microphones for the return signal would be important, but other proven technologies have demonstrated how this issue can be minimized. We'll look at one such example next. One example of this kind of imaging is synthetic aperture radar, or SAR. A satellite equipped with radar and an array of detectors crosses the same area many times per day. Each transit it completes, it makes a very precise measurement of the terrain below, which is compiled to find changes in terrain depth at extremely high resolution. Because the satellite can measure the same location on the Earth while moving in 2 dimensions relative to it, it can take advantage of the fact it is moving quickly in one direction and slowly in the other, quickly across the surface of the Earth and slowly vertically above it. By tracking the same point regardless of the satellite's position over the ground, SAR has the effect of creating a larger effective aperture by taking measurements over a long period. The capabilities of time reversal and synthetic aperture transmitters synthesize into an entire new domain of geospatial intelligence gathering and weapons technology. Like many technologies we've discussed on this channel, SAR's capabilities differ significantly from broader perception of SAR. Research teams and agencies use SAR for surveying and environmental monitoring, leading to acceptance that SAR is only useful for these applications. Radar has always been subject to secrecy. The US's use of specialized aircraft-based radar to map terrain in the Vietnam War was a technology only available then to NASA's Apollo program. There is a noticeable lag between the military capability of SAR and public science. Once you understand the obstacle to effectively using SAR is a software problem, not a physics or hardware problem, the lag between capability and application makes more sense. So, normally this tech is used to detect surface and subsurface changes in the environment. It can also be used in 2 other SIGINT applications we'll discuss today. Radar waves can bounce into hollow structures where they will scatter before eventually coming back out the opening they entered. With enough passes, a satellite emitting these radar waves can build a map of the inside of a structure even if it can't directly see inside it or penetrate it. This has obvious applications. Theoretically, you could use it to peer inside of an aircraft hangar and count the number of planes inside. The surface of the Earth naturally resonates at a small but predictable rate, influenced by a few factors like the Moon's tidal effects and tectonic activity. Changes in this rate at fixed locations can indicate the presence of subsurface voids and structures. The high resolution and large datasets produced by SAR allow this frequency to be calculated over multiple passes, even from space. This technique allows detection of dynamic effects, like underground flowing water. SAR has been used to detect all kinds of transient phenomena normally undetectable by satellite or aircraft. It can detect the disturbance of topsoil and even pebbles on the ground to show where people, animals, and vehicles have recently transited. Digging, trespassing, or underground construction can be revealed with SAR. Consider a satellite equipped with a microwave or radar emitter device. The satellite takes SAR measurements of an object on the surface of the Earth and ascertains its geometry and passive frequency, or lack thereof. We'll use 3 objects as an example: a tree, a large rock, and a concrete building with windows. The satellite can visually identify the tree using radar or optics. It may not see the rock with visible light through a forest canopy, but it can detect it with radar waves, and knows, because it's conducting the ground's natural resonance, that it is a surface object with a density that corresponds to rock. The satellite sees the building and knows it's a hollow structure because it has a different resonant frequency than the rock on the ground. The satellite transmits its findings to a ground-based data center. The data center identifies the building as a target of interest, and begins collating SAR data sent by the satellite to build a 3D map of the structure as radar attenuates through its windows and picks up minor oscillations in the structure. The process goes smoothly, and intelligence sources designate one room inside the structure as a target. Sources believe this room contains electrical equipment and computer servers. However, the analysts have discovered a problem. The room in question has only 2 small windows, and they're facing different directions. In order for their operation to be a success, they acquire another satellite with line of sight to the other window at the same time as the main satellite. A command is sent to the satellite constellation, and both send a time-reverse microwave signal towards the structure. Most of the energy bounces off the outer walls and roof harmlessly, but a small portion enters the window. The radar waves are time-reversed to converge on a small box-shaped space in one corner of the room. Another signal arriving from the second satellite enters the room in the same way, and increases the microwave intensity in this small region. Overall, microwave intensity in the room has only slightly increased, failing to set off environmental alarms or trigger electronic failsafes. However, because time-reversed waves can be focused on an arbitrarily small volume, the microwave attack has been tuned to sweep its microwave focus point throughout the target volume at an arbitrarily small point. Like multiple beams of light focused by lenses but capable of penetrating electrical and thermal insulation, the small point of microwave energy finds and ignites burnable components inside the device, including capacitors, wires, and transistors. A relatively low cross-sectional energy-dense microwave beam has managed to produce high thermal loads inside of an electronic device in a well-protected building and trigger a fire. What I've described is theoretical, but absolutely possible, and would serve to explain some contemporary incidents where unusual thermal effects are witnessed. A forensic analysis of the incident site would reveal a pattern of burning atypical of accidental or natural fires. This approach can be used to simulate forest fires without heating the air. Microwaves are tuned to converge inside of trees, causing them to burn from within without heating the air around the tree or alerting onlookers of a directed energy weapon attack. Suspicion of directed energy weapon use in recent American wildfires arose after investigators found trees at these sites which burned inside out, as if microwaved. Let's assume satellite DEW has been used. Why would it be hard to detect? As mentioned before, the energy density of the attack is relatively low because the signal can be converged within a target. The target object's entire surface can act as a receiver, allowing a few watts per square centimeter to accumulate at a small point. Other objects within the field of attack will not be noticeably affected if they are made of different materials than the target. The high water content of a human body would allow a person to walk right past a tree during an attack without any discomfort, with microwaves attenuating harmlessly in their surface tissues. You might be wondering how it's possible to effectively tune a time-reverse signal to attack real-world objects in the way we've described, considering it's unlikely the attacker would know the precise geometry of the object before or even during the attack. The solution to this issue is simple. The signal is made to sweep a range of values based on the target material using inference, so that a tree trunk with a diameter of either inches or a foot or more will be heated by the same attack signal. If the target is too large or complex for this method, it should be possible to use the satellite's DEW capability in non-attack mode to scan the target in 3 dimensions using SAR, revealing internal structures and voids. Once you know the object's geometry, you then create a custom signal to attack it. Let's step back from satellite-based DEW now. We know from official and unofficial accounts that some of the weapons we've discussed today have been used domestically and in international confrontations with both state and non-state actors.
We have these 300 kilowatt lasers that I won't say they're laboratory because they're better than that. They're more mature. We call them transportable. And so the companies that have built them, these lasers can get moved and used for something. In fact, the first 300 kilowatt that was delivered was supposed to go into an Army truck, but there were some issues with the truck, and so there are now 2 new ones being built. The Navy is waiting on a beam director for theirs, and it's going to White Sands. And so, I won't say those are ruggedized and militarized and ready to go because they're not, but they're also not a laboratory tool either. They're in between.
So the Army's 50 kilowatt things in the Strikers are the most mature as a weapon, and in that sense, the furthest along. And we'll see how they do out in the Middle East theater.
With increasing public interest in the phenomena dubbed Havana Syndrome, it's becoming more clear that psychotronic warfare is involved in a global conflict between adversary nations on a continuing basis. Since their beginning in military use, these weapons have been simultaneously used against domestic and foreign targets. If they are playing a larger role on the global stage now than we think, we should take into account how this tech has been concealed. There is nothing conspiratorial about this perspective. We know from history that this technology has been hidden and classified. My Psychotronics 101 video covers the early development of this technology and the human cost it incurred. If you're entirely new to the topic, I suggest you watch that video at some point, since it will explain how psychotronic warfare contributed to the antagonisms between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as explaining how this technology was contained inside of various agencies in total secrecy for decades. This video will not discuss in detail the history of the Havana Syndrome, but it's fairly obvious how our discussion will overlap with it. By the end of the video, I hope we will be able to identify what symptoms and anomalous phenomena are expected when this tech is used as a weapon. If our purpose today is to define the capabilities, mechanisms, and designs of known systems spanning decades of development, we need some way to categorize them. Even in the case of fighter aircraft technology, there is no single consensus on what constitutes generational steps in military tech. The US Air Power Development Center defines the difference between first and second generation modern fighters as progression from transonic to supersonic missile armament. The Air Force magazine, by contrast, defines this step as the transition from conventional projectiles, such as machine guns and cannons, to missile arms, as well as standardization of combat radar systems. Because psychotronics is a controversial technology, it is not formally identified by military organizations, like generations of tanks and aircraft are. Additionally, psychotronic weapons are not exclusively operated by military organizations, as other specialized military equipment is. Therefore, we will develop our own logical generational system to track the advancement of psychotronic tech. Generation 1 are called generators. The first true psychotronic devices can be traced back to Czech researcher Robert Pavlida's generators, which the Defense Intelligence Agency described in classified reports in 1975. Pavlida's work had started much earlier while studying parapsychology. Parapsychology, as you likely know, is the study of psychic phenomena such as telekinesis, telepathy, and precognition. Pavlida did not intend his studies to become the basis of weapons, but he was aware this capability would exist. His work became the cornerstone of the modern Czech cultural affirmation of parapsychology, and also the Soviet scientific inquiry into human psychokinesis abilities. These intersecting motivations, from one angle a scientific study by national interests, and from another angle an investigation into the more subjective and less developed field of early parapsychology, culminate into what are known as generator devices. What qualifies these systems as psychotronic is their effects on human physiology and their use of electromagnetic or acoustic energy. In its 1975 report on the state of Soviet and Czech research, the DIA cites historical conceptions of a speculative life energy to contextualize this research. Quote, "The concept of man as a source of unusual energy dates back at least as far as ancient Chinese and Hindu teachings, in which it is called 10 vital energies or prana. Between the 18th and 20th centuries, it was called various things: animal magnetism, odic force, motor force, N-rays, etheric force, etc. The weapons applications are discussed later in the document, with Pavlida's generators described as being capable of killing flies and putting snails into a hibernation state. Quote, "If Pavlida's devices can kill insects at present, their potential in the future after refinement and enlargement may well be for killing men. If bioenergy can be reliably controlled and focused by such devices, death could be caused by disruption of fundamental brain rhythms, heart control, or biological clock mechanisms." These assertions are made as a counterpoint to the observations by Pavlida that the so-called bioenergy these devices function on can be used to heal and relax people. Quote, "The question will arise whether knowledge and the equipment developed will be used for the enhancement of human freedom and social development or for regimentation and enslavement. The Czechs claim that a direct transfer of biological energy from healthy to diseased or injured muscle is not only possible, but proven. The DIA document notes these claims are subject to the highly ideological nature of the Soviet information complex, giving them a meaning that extends beyond face value. The document discusses the fact Soviet research considered electromagnetism and psionic ability to be closely connected. An interesting point, but outside of our discussion today. Electromagnetic disruption of living organisms is certainly a real phenomenon, but it's unclear in this historical case where physics ends and parapsychology begins. Later iterations on this line of thinking would resolve some of these problems. Uncertainty over what exact physical mechanisms are affected and a spectrum of unintended side effects is what relegates these technologies as Generation 1. Today, most Gen 1 psychotronic weapons are not necessarily weapons by design, but their operation can be modified to have weaponizable effects. The basic mechanism used in Gen 2 systems expand to include a directional aspect. They do not vary greatly from Gen 1 technologically, but have been optimized for weaponization by allowing the EM, microwave, and acoustic energy they produce to be focused and directed at distant targets. Like Gen 1, the effects of Gen 2 systems are limited, because their disruptive effects can be inconsistent. One prominent example of such a system is the microwave weapons used at the US Embassy in Moscow, whose presence was dubbed the Moscow signal, reportedly used to trigger listening devices or induce health problems in embassy staff. Some directed energy weapons, specifically those capable of destroying non-human material, diverge from the classification of psychotronic, because they do not interact with human neurobiology in order to be effective weapons. Most of these systems rely on thermal effects to cause damage, but some also leverage acoustics or other types of radiation to degrade materials. Example of non-psychotronic DEWs include particle beams and most lethal X-ray or microwave weapons. Evidence suggests both Gen 1 and Gen 2 systems were applied from the mid-century to around the 1990s, with some continued uses today in the private sector, making this generation by far the most accessible.
Calls are mounting in Serbia for an independent investigation into whether a sonic weapon was used by security forces on people protesting government corruption.
Just because these systems are not as complex as later generations does not mean they're less capable in specific situations. We'll talk more about this later. If a Gen 2 acoustic weapon used for crowd control affects a group of people, the Gen 3 equivalent would be used to target individuals inside the crowd without alerting others. To accomplish this, Gen 3 systems tend to rely on arrays of psychotronic devices, working in tandem to create a small area where signals overlap and create interference. The Voice of God systems, described by coalition forces in Desert Storm, are Gen 3 devices. Unlike Gen 1 and 2, this generation more closely resembles modern battlefield electronic warfare systems, and are thus capable of conventional military applications against equipment as well as humans. However, the advantages of Gen 3 systems stop short of lethal applications compared to simpler Gen 2 counterparts. Less lethality, more capability. The next advancement occurred in the 2000s, with the widespread adoption of brain imaging technologies like electroencephalograms, positron emission tomography, and fMRI. In general terms, this generation seeks to resolve the reality that meaningful neural data can be imaged and extracted from the brain. The obvious question is what kind of information can be obtained with this method reliably, using the kind of directed energy systems used in Gen 3. The answer is that this approach has severe limitations due to the energy density limits of the transmission medium. Therefore, publicly known Gen 4 devices tend to be surgically implanted, removing the obstacle of broadcasting signals through the air. One example is DARPA's Restoring Active Memory program, started in 2013. Quote, RAM researchers focused on episodic memory, which includes information a person need only remember for brief periods, such as where a car is parked, what was served for dinner on a previous evening, or when he or she last took medication. RAM researchers used surgically implanted electrodes to record neuronal activity in the volunteers' CA3 and CA1 regions as the volunteers performed a visual memory test. The study participants were shown a simple image, such as a color block, and then, after a brief delay, during which the screen was blank, were asked to identify the initial image out of 4 or 5 others shown on the screen. By analyzing the recordings associated with correct responses, the researchers were able to construct what's known as a multi-input, multi-output, or MIMO, nonlinear mathematical spatiotemporal model that predicted the transformation of neuronal firing patterns in the CA3 region into neuronal firing patterns in the CA1 region during successful memory formation. The codes that the model produced did not directly reference specific memories, but instead correlated to the CA1 firing patterns that occur when CA3 encodes information properly, thus correcting for any naturally occurring errors in transformation between CA3 and CA1 firing. Again, pretty technical stuff. In other words, researchers watched brain activity as they exposed the subject to specific concepts. This allowed them to construct a model of what specific patterns of brain activity meant in the individual. RAM researchers' efforts bore fruit when they began artificially stimulating the brain using the same patterns they observed in the CA3 and CA1 regions. They found that epileptic patients who struggled with memory retrieval had an increase of about 37% accuracy in retrieving memories when their surgically implanted electrodes assisted them. This research is very interesting, but what does it mean for psychotronics? We're left wondering if non-implanted systems are capable of achieving Gen 4 in our classification scale. Due to the limitations of data resolution even with implanted devices, effective use of Gen 4 systems relies on continual exposure to the device to collect information on how the targeted individual's brain functions and what kind of information is stored in their episodic and long-term memory. This is fine for targets that can be tracked, but more difficult for targets of opportunity. Non-implanted weapons can achieve Gen 4 capability, but this implies a more sophisticated and time-consuming method of attack, since you can't just go around implanting electrodes into people's brains who you're trying to monitor. Gen 4 systems also attempt to conceal their own presence by adhering to the principles of military signal intelligence by considering possible countermeasures, and will attempt to mitigate them. Exactly how this is done varies depending on the psychotronic methods used. The RAM program, for example, performs its human-machine interface capability without reliance on external processing power or communications equipment, making it practical as a tool in the modern electronic warfare-dominated battlefield. The reality of fourth-generation psychotronics to be leveraged as weapons, marketing tools, and to invade personal privacy were realized by neuroscientist Raphael Yuste, who proposed that 5 new categories of neural rights be added to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As of today, brain activity is not considered personal information, as the definition is interpreted. The potential for surgically implanted systems akin to Gen 4 psychotronic weapons to cure intractable neurological diseases like Alzheimer's or epilepsy illustrates the same inherent problem parapsychology researchers encountered decades earlier. These technologies have the potential to do tremendous good or cause irreparable harm depending on how they are wielded and by who. DARPA's Next Generation Non-Surgical Neurotechnology, or NCubed program, epitomizes the 5th generation of psychotronic systems by resolving the main limitations of Gen 4, the need to surgically implant devices. The NCubed program uses materials that mimic the electrical properties of human tissues to create a channel for electrical impulses to propagate between the brain and the device. This link may be electrodes placed on the skin for the ability to read and write via forced neuron activation using electromagnetic fields. Quote, Incubed has the precision to read from and write to 16 independent channels within a 16mm cubed volume of neural tissue within 50 milliseconds. Each channel is capable of specifically interacting with submillimeter regions of the brain with a spatial and temporal specificity that rivals existing invasive approaches. Even though these systems are non-surgical, they can still be invasive, administered into the bloodstream either via injection, inhalation, or consumption as nanomachines. The DARPA research describes EMNTs. Quote, "One of the key MENT attributes are their incredibly small size. Thousands of EMNTs can fit across the width of a human hair. The MENTs are first injected into the circulatory system and then guided with a magnet to the targeted area of the brain. Our current data suggests we can non-surgically introduce MENTs into the brain for subsequent bidirectional neural interfacing. Bidirectional meaning the MENTs can both trigger brain responses and read them. We've seen steps forward in using optical scattering for detecting electrical activity in the brain, meaning an array of optical beams directed at a target can be used to record brain activity. This capability helps the transmission range problems inherent to Gen 5 nanoscale devices. DARPA describes in this 2019 report its 6 paths towards achieving full Gen 5 capability. 1. The Carnegie Mellon University team aims to develop a completely non-invasive device that uses a acousto-optical approach to record from the brain and interfering electrical fields to write to specific neurons. The team will use ultrasound waves to guide light into and out of the brain to detect neural activity. The team's write approach exploits the nonlinear response of neurons to electric fields to enable localized stimulation of specific cell types. Pretty crazy stuff. The Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory team aims to develop a completely non-invasive, coherent optical system for recording from the brain. The system will directly measure optical path length changes in the neural tissue that correlate with neural activity. In other words, at very small scales, neurons slightly change in their dimensions as they're used. Optical beams can measure this. The Park team aims to develop a completely non-invasive acoustomagnetic device for writing to the brain. Their approach pairs ultrasound waves with magnetic fields to generate localized electric currents for neuromodulation. The hybrid approach offers the potential for localized neuromodulation deeper in the brain. The Rice University team aims to develop a minutely invasive, bidirectional system for recording from and writing to the brain. For the recording function, the device will use diffuse optical tomography to infer neural activity by measuring light scattering in neural tissue. To enable the write function, the team will use a magnetogenetic approach to make neurons sensitive to magnetic fields. Yes, so you're basically talking about changing the human genome to make neurons more sensitive than they already are to magnetism. The Teledyne team aims to develop a completely non-invasive integrated device that uses micro-optically pumped magnetometers to detect small localized magnetic fields that correlate with neural activity. The team will also use focused ultrasound for writing to neurons. All of these capabilities are being pitched by DARPA under the pretense of developing a bidirectional brain interface to increase reaction time and reasoning ability of soldiers on the battlefield, but some of these methods can be accomplished using focused rays. Surgically implanted devices and specialized helmets are not necessarily needed. With these approaches in mind, we can see the parameters that define a Gen 5 psychotronic device. Further, these systems employ algorithms to address the scattering of signals as they pass through the skull and other tissues. Gen 5 systems are not limited to electrical stimulation, and can also be realized with acoustic, electromagnetic, and optical approaches, as we've seen. Secrecy means the state of ongoing psychotronic development can be difficult to assess. However, looking at the trends of generational advancement and the shortcomings of Gen 5 systems, we can project the cutting edge and near-future state of the technology fairly accurately. By far, the greatest shortcoming of interfaces capable of reading and writing information directly to the brain is the need to collect personalized information on the individual's neurological makeup. Every brain is different, so past systems needed long periods of data collection and modeling to construct an accurate model of each individual's neurological functions. Using artificial neural networks to establish a cluster of likely neurological activity profiles will allow interaction without an observational period. Obviously, in surveillance and warfare, this would make a big difference. We can see the requisite technologies for Gen 6 systems already in the scientific community. In 2013, a team of Japanese researchers developed a method for visualizing dreams by establishing correlations between brain responses to visual stimuli and then comparing them to activity during dreaming. This allowed researchers to predict the subject of dreams with around 60% accuracy. These cues were then used to reconstruct a visual artificial intelligence model to generate an approximation of the dream in real time, a visual output. The clear distinction between this research and a true Gen 6 psychotronic system is the capability to extract the dream information without first studying the brain's reaction to visual stimuli while the subject is awake. You're not building a map of the brain, but you still need to know how the brain responds to a visual stimuli as you plan to present it later. A Gen 6 system can alternate between likely attack methods until it finds one the target is vulnerable to. So if you have enough data on hand, you can overcome this issue of having to measure people's different neurological responses by just assuming they'll fit into one of your pre-existing categories. It's accurate to say the challenges of Gen 6 are mostly software and data processing related, and not strictly theoretical or physical. Given the ever-increasing importance of AI and data science across all generational leaps in technology today, this makes sense. The leap into Gen 6 from Gen 5 also presents a unique paradigm for how it can be applied, just like each generation before. These devices can be made so small they will not be detected without a microscope and can be triggered remotely based on the data they're gathering. The potential here for surveillance or warfare is endless. The machines can be deployed in aerosolized form and ingested through air, food, or water. Once inside the body, they can begin transmitting a localized signal containing granular information about the target's thought. If the target has been identified as a threat, the device switches into an active mode where it attempts to directly control thoughts, instincts, and actions. So we've talked about some pretty sophisticated psychotronic systems, and while these systems are theoretically possible, there isn't that much evidence of their use in domestic or military applications today. It's important to realize less sophisticated systems can still be used effectively in a number of situations. We'll look at a few examples. Consider 3 different individuals. A relaxed non-combatant in a low-stress environment. For example, you sitting at home on the couch or in front of the computer. An alert combatant in a low-stress combat environment. A combatant on patrol in a safe region, or somebody sitting in a barracks. An engaged combatant in a high-stress combat environment, somebody who is actively engaged in combat and is on full alert. Our objective here is simple: to induce mental and physical fatigue as immediately as possible. We'll assume each person is in visual line of sight to the weapon, with the most protection being a window, a tarp, or a camouflage net, respectively. In example A, something as simple as a Gen 2 acoustic system can be used to induce torpor, a sleep-like state. The target's brainwaves will be relatively easy to predict without having to gather real-time data. As a downside, the signal will be audible and may cause the target to leave the area before they are affected. Alternatively, a Gen 3 electromagnetic system can be used to minimize detection with the same results. In example B, a Gen 3 electromagnetic system or a microwave system can be used to mimic the low spectrum of brainwave activity and induce relaxation. If the environment remains calm, a continued attack will eventually lead to induced calmness and eventually sleep. In example C, the target is in a much more difficult position to attack. Not only is their brainwave activity harder to predict, but they may be more paranoid to emotional changes in general. They may not perceive an attack as coming from a psychotronic source, but they are instinctually more likely to interpret changes in cognition and attempt to self-correct. In this case, a Gen 2 or Gen 3 attack is limited to inducing confusion or stress. A Gen 4 or 5 system is needed to override higher function and put the target to sleep. I hope this demonstrates how less complex Gen 2 and Gen 3 systems are just as powerful as highly advanced Gen 5 systems, depending on their context. We've seen there are many technologies involved in psychotronics. Understanding how a specific system works will vary by device and application, and there are a lot of them. Recall that development of these systems was possible before neuroscience fully understood the mechanisms in the brain, and is evidenced by Andrei Puharich's interest in nerve conduction before it was real official science. How quickly electrical signals propagate across the nervous system was not really considered prior to Puharich's musings, yet he accurately predicted that this would one day become an essential part of neuroscience. Similarly, the first psychotronic devices were tested on humans before interactions between the human nervous system and electromagnetic radiation were known. Learning how to interact with the brain, using external signals through the body's various tissues and air, has accelerated greatly in the last 3 decades, with prominent figures like Elon Musk bringing public awareness to the race for true non-invasive brain interface technology, something that's occurring at research institutions all around the world. Because of this reality, we should familiarize ourselves with the overall state of neuroscience's understanding of the way different brain states are induced. There are 2 ways of modeling how experiences become internalized in the brain. The first is done by measuring brainwave activity, either across the entire brain or in either hemisphere. Predominance of certain frequencies called slow, moderate, and fast waves indicate overall brain state, from focus to relaxation to sleep. This approach has traditionally used EEG for detection. What do these frequencies actually mean, though? Understanding this will help us relate how psychotronics work as well, especially Gen 2 and Gen 3 systems. The central nervous system is in electrical resonance, with certain neural circuits or brain regions oscillating as their neurons fire at a predictable rate. These oscillations arise from synchronized firing from nerve stimulation, from electrochemical potentials in the membranes themselves, and from network interactions between different regions. Take, for example, US 6081744A, electric fringe field generator for manipulating nervous systems. This 1993 patent uses, quote, externally applied weak fluctuating electric fields, tuned to certain frequencies such as to excite a resonance in neural circuits. Depending on the frequency chosen, excitation of such resonances causes in a human subject relaxation, sleepiness, sexual excitement, or the slowing of certain cortical processes. End quote. Let's put this knowledge into context. The lowest level of electrical resonance is created by single neurons as their voltage-gated potassium or sodium channels oscillate. An electrical signal at around 10 Hz will amplify these interactions. Feedback loops, or circuits in larger clusters of neurons, generate rhythms between 30 and 80 Hz, as pyramidal interneuron gamma models describe. Yeah, that's a mouthful. The frequency bands of these oscillations are shaped by delays and refractory periods between 1 and 10 milliseconds. Long-range connections, such as thalamocortical loops, create synchronized regions that are physically far apart, linking different parts of the CNS. One example of this is the alpha resonance found in the visual cortex. The visual cortex has multiple layers of activity, made up of the aforementioned feedback loops that organize into larger connections with their own frequency ranges. The range of frequencies of most processes in the brain falls within 0.1 and 90 Hz. One interesting feature of brain activity is its direct mirroring of the frequencies of the Schumann resonances. You'll recall we discussed in an earlier patent that the Schumann resonances can be used to provoke ion cyclotron resonance in polar liquids like water, making its molecules move in small orbital motions and promoting cellular processes. It's interesting that electrical resonance in the Earth's atmosphere, in the human brain, and in ideal growth conditions of modern bioreactors follow the same exact set of frequencies. Without going into too much detail that we'll save for a later video, the correlation between each of these systems is not the result of common energy propagation rates through similar materials. Recent research has actually found that numerous forces play into atmospheric resonances, from solar wind dynamics in the ionosphere to even gravitational waves. We don't understand why the Schumann resonance appears over and over again in geophysics and biology under very different conditions, but the topic is of great interest. It's one thing to measure the entire brain's dominant frequency, but today understanding brain activity is also done by mapping the electrical activity in three-dimensional space. This approach allows discovery of specific memory-related behavior and not just overall focus or mood. Unlike brainwaves, the specific regions of activity vary from person to person, though there are known regions of the brain universally involved in long and short-term memory. A model must be created on a per-person basis by exposing the individual to various stimuli and seeing what parts of the brain respond. This is accomplished using high-resolution imaging tech like fMRI. Though we can construct a profile of a person and essentially read their thoughts with enough time and data, the actual flow of information through the brain remains a black box without proper context. Consider an analogy of a fisherman on a paddle boat. He watches the ripples in the water and knows certain patterns at certain times of day means a storm is coming. He doesn't see the complex eddies and currents causing ripples just below the surface, nor is he accurately measuring wind speed. The fact he has seen the ripples and what weather has followed them thousands of times before allows him to interpret future weather accurately. This is basically what we're doing with fMRI in the brain. Given the nature of this problem, computing ability will be the limiting factor, even if we achieve ultra-high resolutions with brain imaging technologies. Artificial intelligence and quantum computing offer some relief to this dilemma, and will most likely one day be the solution. Suffice to say, understanding brain interactions is a synthesis of neuroscience, biophysics, and computational modeling, which is a relatively new paradigm. Between the barriers of trade secrets and classified research, factual information about some specific mechanisms does exist. Take, for example, the phenomenon of torpor, which we mentioned before, also known as synthetic hypothermia or artificial hibernation. Experiments have proven animals, including rodents, can be put into a hibernation state indefinitely using acoustic waves focused on the hypothalamus. Officially, this procedure has only been attempted in rodents, but researchers note the protein responsible for this interaction between acoustic waves and the brain also exists in humans. Proposed uses include putting humans into hibernation for long space voyages or for medical recovery, but as we've seen, these technologies, with potential weapons applications, are rarely limited to medicine. Even though researchers have achieved Gen 5 psychotronic capability in public science, we should take a moment to say that officially the United States arsenal only possesses devices fitting the Gen 3 description, while China has publicly described projects up to a Gen 4 equivalence in their military. It's difficult to say for certain where private development stands in respect to official government activities, but commercial systems reportedly used by private security and police are usually Gen 2 or 3, usually with engineered limitations on their power. However, it's worth mentioning much more complex Gen 5 or 6 level devices have been theorized and patented. Because there is no obligation to disclose the use of these systems, it's likely Gen 5 or 6 systems have already been used in some instances. The specificity of many patents further indicates successful testing of such devices. Psychotronic weapons are electronic by definition, and are extremely vulnerable to direct attack with electronic warfare countermeasures. Devices that rely on reading acoustic, electric, or optical signals from a target can be easily spoofed by personal electronic warfare equipment. Typical walkie-talkie sized or backpack sized battery-powered devices intended to boost the range of radio and guidance jamming equipment are normally carried by individuals or on combat vehicles. The predominance of drones in modern battle spaces has led to increased availability and popularity of individual EW. Most of these devices can counter some but not all types of psychotronic weaponry using electromagnetism or microwaves, but they are unlikely to be effective against optical and acoustic weapons. This sheds a little bit of light on why we don't see psychotronics used in contemporary conflicts. Well, we've covered a lot, and I know that some of this was very technical. I hope you got something valuable out of everything we've discussed today, and I'd like to summarize our whole discussion into 7 very simple points. 1. Brain activity is not considered a personal right and can be monitored by anyone. 2. Psychotronic weapon systems can also be used for tracking and data collection. 3. Chemical and electrical processes in all types of cells can be influenced by psychotronics. 4. Effective use of psychotronics requires coordinated and continual targeting. 5. Multispectral attacks can be masked to lower odds of detection. 6. Civilian telecom and energy infrastructure can be pressed into weapons applications. 7. Psychotronic weapons may have therapeutic effects below their harmful threshold. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and have a good evening. Don't think too hard about this stuff. Bye-bye.